I'm David Brinkley, NBC News. Kent State University in Ohio has had campus violence for 3 nights, causing the National Guard to be called in. And today the guardsmen opened fire on the students, killing 4 of them, 2 young men and 2 young women.
On May 4th, 1970, Kent State University students attended a protest to raise their objections against the Cambodian campaign in the Vietnam War. The protest soon became violent, and when the National Guard intervened, the event ended tragically with 13 casualties. This event sparked nationwide student protests against the National Guard's methods of controlling riots, and finally, the protesters inspired student activism and changed the National Guard's methods and policies. The Kent State shooting was a major contributor to the war protest efforts. These protests were made up of college students and other brave individuals who wanted a change, a triumph to end the tragedy. No one knew exactly what happened on May 4th, 1970, but one thing was clear: it would change American history forever.
21 GIs bound for a jungle clearing a mile from the Cambodian border.
Every wildfire starts from a spark, and every spark starts from a mistake. That mistake was America's choice to bomb and raid Cambodian territory, also known as the Cambodian Campaign. The countrywide Vietnam War protests can be traced to the United States' involvement in the Vietnamese Civil War. This was a conflict between the United States, South Vietnam, and her sovereign allies, who sought to end communism in Asia, and the North Vietnamese, who with their allies, including Russia and China, sought to conquer Vietnam and spread communist ideals. In the case of the Kent State shootings, the protesters were against the invasion of Cambodia. The reason for attacking Cambodia was because of the large amounts of fleeing Viet Cong forces who resided and restocked within the eastern boundaries of the country.
It all started earlier that weekend. Richard Nixon, who was then president, sent troops into Cambodia.
Attacks are being launched this week to clean out major enemy sanctuaries on the Cambodian-Vietnam border.
Students and citizens were angry because of how the United States trespassed into Cambodia without prior acknowledgement in order to capture the Viet Cong members. In many people's eyes, the American soldiers were illegally crossing an Allies' border and spreading the war into other countries. As a result, protests all around the country sparked, including the infamous one on the Kent State University campus.
Total and utter shock.
On May 1st, 1970, a group of college students who attended Kent State University gathered in the Commons to protest the United States' interference in Cambodia and in the Vietnam War as a whole. The protest started peacefully, but as the participants became more infuriated, they started to verbally abuse the police. They said things like, "Pigs, get off our campus," and shouted foul language at law enforcement. Soon, the event became violent.
They caused some damage.
They stopped cars and started bonfires in the streets. Then, the National Guard was called to the scene. A few days later, on May 4th, thousands of Kent State students congregated into the Commons to protest once again.
On the day of the shootings, it was a nice spring day. There were soldiers everywhere. The girls were flirting with the soldiers. At noon on that day, there was a protest scheduled. Protest Nixon, protest the war, protest the National Guard being on campus.
Shortly before noon, General Canterbury, along with General Del Corso, declared that the demonstrators were to disperse and that the rally was prohibited. However, this was ignored and was met with angry shouting and rock throwing.
Well, they said that the students were throwing things at them, so they fired tear gas.
And some of the canisters were thrown back at the guards.
Needless to say, that was not a real wise thing to do. But then the National Guard opened up and shot. And we hear this da-da-da-da-da-da. And knowing what was going on, I said, how stupid. Why would anyone, when everyone's all uptight, why would they shoot off cherry bombs? And there was a guy that always sat with this other girl and I, And he said really quietly, and even when I tell the story, I get shivers up my back. He said, those weren't cherry bombs. He knew it was a gun.
28 guardsmen suddenly fired their rifles. Many guardsmen shot into the air to scare the protesters, however some shot directly into the crowd. Nobody knows exactly what happened, however one thing is certain. This tragedy ended with 4 students dead and 9 injured. William Schroeder, Jeffrey Miller, Allison Krauss, and Sandy Schuer would not live to see the aftermath of their efforts.
The spark of the Kent State shootings ignited a wildfire across the nation. After learning of the Kent State shootings, college students around the country were outraged at how their fellow students were mistreated. People felt that although the students were showing signs of aggressiveness, they were passive enough not to be considered a riot, and especially not to be shot at. However, many citizens believed that the students brought it upon themselves. People believed that the National Guard were wrong in opening fire. However, the students were also wrong in being violent.
They have every right to speak their mind, but they have to do it peacefully, and they can't threaten the safety of others.
Protests were held for remembering the victims of the Kent State shootings, and to ensure that they did not die in vain, and that their ideas would be remembered. The Kent State shooting triggered a nationwide strike of students, forcing hundreds of institutions to close. The students that died at the Kent State shootings were carved into each of these students' hearts and memories. In vengeance, students rose up around the entire country to protest against the war and the actions done on the victims of the Kent State shooting.
Then President Richard Nixon blamed protesters for the incident, saying, "When dissent turns into violence, it invites tragedy," which came off as cold to many. The president's speechwriter Ray Price even said the guardsmen were only a bunch of scared kids with guns. But the tragedy of the Kent State shootings led to the triumphs for the nation, the students, and future generations to come. The shootings brought national attention to the Vietnam War and inspired many protests that would end the war sooner. A presidential commission that investigated the matter concluded that the tragedy was unnecessary, unwarranted, and inexcusable.
I went to the Presidential Commission hearings on the shootings when they asked General Del Corso, who was the general of the National Guard, why the National Guard shot into the crowd. He said, because if we'd have shot in the air, we might have hit someone.
Students were also given a signed statement of regret from the guards. Additionally, Kent State University established the School of Peace and Conflict in order to educate future generations how to handle conflicts in a more peaceful manner. After the Kent State shootings, law enforcement dealt with protests in a much more peaceful way.
In light of what happened at Kent State, it made some dramatic changes for how the National Guard trained for these events.
The Kent State shootings inspired countless student protests. A few of these include the million-student march on college campuses to protest college fees, and the National Student Walkout, which took place in schools all across the nation who rallied for gun control. This has also changed the way the National Guard deals with protests. Many people now believe that the guardsmen were at fault due to the use of lethal weapons, while the students were using less harmful violence.
You have to make sure that whatever violence is being inflicted on you, that you don't exceed the violence on your side of it, that you match it equally.
Many new policies were put into place in the National Guard. Specifically, the use of live ammunition, or quickly fired bullets, was banned.
The use of live ammunition for a civil disturbance in the National Guard, that policy is very, very strict about how you can use it. And without going into a bunch of operational security details about it, it's just something that would almost never be done today.
As Jeffrey Miller's mother said about the Kent State shootings, "Every time I remember it, I feel the pain all over again." She was personally connected to this event, but she summarized how many people felt about the Kent State shootings. This tragic event divided the entire nation on the National Guard's actions and has impacted how they control civil disturbances. The shooting sparked a wildfire of change by changing the National Guard, inspiring student protests, and serving justice to the students. On May 4th, 1970, the course of American policy and history were altered forever at Kent State University. Student-led protests of the Vietnam War were held on campus. These protests brought the war back home, and when push came to shove, the guardsmen opened fire. As a result of this tragedy, the National Guard undertook policies, such as the ban of live ammunition at civil disturbances, to prevent actions like those at Kent State to ever occur again. The Kent State shootings were a tragic moment in the United States history. However, they led to a triumph that changed conflict resolution and student activism forever.